Okay, hi everyone. If you could take your seat, we'll get started. Thanks for coming out on the first Monday after Thanksgiving in the snow. My name's Ethan Fry. I'm a program officer on the Cities and States team here at Ford. Wanted to start with a few words of thanks. I'd like to give special thanks to our panelists, Nick, Kim, Bijou, and Yokai, who made special arrangements to be here today. Thank you for doing that. Unfortunately, Yokai got stuck in Boston due to the snow, but he did record a video which we'll show to kick off the panel discussion. But sorry that he couldn't be here with us. 2 notes of logistics. So we'll have books available for folks after the event, and Nick will stay and sign books and be around, at least briefly, for discussion. So we'd encourage you to stay. And then we'll be recording the event as well. So during the discussion, if you have any questions, please use the mics on either side of the room. And then just a few words to set up today's event. So here at the Ford Foundation, in pursuit of social change, we say that we support ideas, institutions, and individuals. Nick Books powerfully touches on all three and connects them in impressive ways, often transcending the traditional structure-agency binary. In his book, I found a really fascinating interaction between changing ideological frameworks represented as eras defined by organizations, transactions, and networks, which you'll hear about, which operate in more invisible and hidden ways, and more often at the macrostructural level, but really define the choice set for policy actors and business investors alike. B, contests between individuals who exercise agency on the world to shape and mold and actually instantiate new worldviews, empowering or disempowering actors like states or markets, excluding or including whole categories of populations based on race or other factors. And as Nick notes, economic orders are made, not born. Individuals play a big role in that. And of course, C, the defining role of institutions that organize both corporate and civic life and government as well, which serve even still today as the foundational building blocks of our democratic capitalist system. I imagine today's conversation will focus a great deal on relationships between these three categories, ideological frameworks, individuals, institutions, but also the larger boundary struggles, as Nancy Fraser calls them, between market and state, the intercapitalist boundary struggles between finance and business sectors, which was a big part of the book, between internet-enabled networks like algorithmic decision-making schemes, and, well, perhaps everything else. So before I turn to the panelists, one issue I did want to call forward was the issue of race, and the way in which issues of race intersect with changing conceptions of what makes a good society, and between the boundary struggles I noted above. Nick notes in the book that although the original state market arrangement that emerged from the New Deal, which largely provided for the many through corporate and not state welfare schemes like employer-provided healthcare and the like, those still did exclude others largely defined by race, but also gender and other isms. As the country changes and as communities of color are able to make greater and greater claims on the public domain, it's no surprise that what we define as public has also changed. So I'd encourage each of the panelists to keep forefront issues of race and racial justice, in particular as they intersect with the rise of finance capital specifically and public power generally. Finally, in organizing today's event, Nick and I and the events team here at Ford and my colleagues Jose Garcia, Lori McGlinchey, Sanji Rao, Joshua Sinelli, who I'd like to give thanks to as well. We sought to recruit perspectives to speak to each of the eras Nick defines, but who could also speak to the interrelationships among and between. As such, we're delighted that Bijou Matthew, co-founder of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance and secretary of the National Taxi Workers Alliance and professor at Rider University, is here today. Kim Phillips Fine, 20th century American historian at the Gallatin School at New York University. And of course, our author, Nick Lemon, excuse me. Let's see, what else do I have here? So today we'll open, Nick will open with brief remarks to introduce the book. And then Nick will kind of self-moderate a discussion, participate in a discussion with Kim and Bijou. We'll show the video before Kim and Bijou open up with some remarks. We'll have about 30 minutes for discussion with them, and then 15 minutes or so for a discussion with all of you. And at the closing, Sarita Gupta, our new director of the Future Workers team, will close with some remarks. With that said, Nick, Kim, and Bijou, welcome to the stage.
Is this live? Yes. So first, thanks, Ethan, and everybody at Ford. This is, every author's dream is to be able to talk about a book in this kind of setting. Part of the pain of being an author, as you must know, is people say, okay, you wrote a book, give me the 30-second takeaway. And this is hard to boil down to that format. So it's nice to, hope that you're at the beginning of what can be an ongoing discussion. I live, I guess, at this point in my life, sort of with one foot in the academic world and one foot in the journalistic world. So it might be helpful. When I first started working on the book, wanting to do the book, I had a lunch with my agent, and we had a conversation where I was sounding a lot like Ethan was in his introduction. And at the end of the lunch, my agent said, "I have no idea what you just said," and because she needs to know who the characters are, So this isn't a certain kind of event. I would do be like people who write nonfiction books and all they want to know is what's your narrative construction strategy, and leave out the ideas. And I actually found that after I wrote the book, I gave the manuscript to a couple of academic friends for vetting, and they said, I have no idea what you're talking about because you got to get all these characters out of there so I can understand what you're trying to say. But I do think it would be useful just to start things off to just lay out briefly the story I tell in the book, because I assume most of you won't have been able to read it. Slipping into academic ease a little, there's a lot of agreement about the dependent variable, and the dependent variable is, we live in a world of ever-rising inequality, a lot of political unrest, and a sort of loss of what had seemed to be a consensus toward the turn of the millennium, and a lot of political contention, people who had been total outsiders to politics emerging from left and right as major figures, tremendous distrust of elites, and a degree of sort of disruption and instability. So the question is, what made this happen? And there's a whole lot of answers around to that question. I won't run through all of them. What I'm trying to do as my answer, so what's the independent variable or set of independent variables, is to look at what I guess you'd call political economy and say, how was American capitalism and to some extent global capitalism structured at different times to create different kinds of social orders, none of which I want to be nostalgic about, all of which have good things and bad things about them, none of which can be brought back. But I think it's clarifying to think about capitalism as being sort of organized along the lines of several big ideas, and to think how it might next be organized. I have running through the book as a kind of reality test repeated visits to a blue-collar neighborhood in Chicago called Chicago Lawn on the southwest side near Midway Airport. This is one of the places race comes in the book, because this is a neighborhood, if you know it, that used to be, it was the neighborhood where Dr. King got the brick thrown at him and hit in the head, for example. It's a neighborhood that went from being all white to basically all minority. Today it's about half African American, half Latinx. So and the neighborhood has been caught up in a lot of these different economic changes that have taken place over time. So I don't want to make it sound like the ideas I'm about to talk about are taking place somewhere up in the stratosphere and they're very abstract and it's all like reading The Economist. These are, as these orders change, they have real effects on real people's lives. So I'm proposing a scheme that is first an institution-oriented society or social order or political economy that grew up, in the New Deal era and somewhat before, and lasted through, let's say, the 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. Then what I'm calling transaction era that came on in the 70s, kind of, to some extent, is still going on, but like I would bookend it with the financial crisis of 2008. And then the third is networks, which is about a society organized around internet-based networks. These networks exist and they've given rise to very big, successful companies. I don't think they've met the test yet, and they may never, of creating an actual social order. And in a way, as Ethan mentioned, a lot of the book is about a tension between a sort of corporate-based social order that emerged, at least was one of the things that emerged out of the New Deal, and a more finance-oriented social order. So if you're kind of on the left, as I assume many people here are, you have to wrap your head around the perhaps unfamiliar idea that corporations and finance are not the same thing. And in the real life, they're sort of in opposition to each other, and there's been a very consequential power shift between them. So, quickie version is there's a corporation, as Ethan said, a corporation-based social order that worked for a lot of people. My title is sort of playing on The Organization Man by William White from 1958. Excluded a lot of people also. I do not want to be too nostalgic about it, but people who were in it, including a lot of the people in Chicago Lawn, had a kind of economic security, and in addition to benefits, pensions, etc. And then that world really blew up dramatically, in my view, because of changes in the financial system that were enabled by changes in the political system. And so in terms of independent variables, I think the importance of the financialization of America has been somewhat underestimated as an explanatory factor in how we got here today. Last thing, very quickly, just to mention the three main characters in the book. Adolph Burley, a New Dealer, a member of FDR's Brain Trust. I can talk more about these later if you're interested. Second is an economist, a Chicago school economist named Michael Jensen, who was kind of the intellectual godfather of the so-called shareholder revolution or financial revolution, not the cause of it, but a heavy theoretician of it. And the third is a Silicon Valley sort of kingpin named Reid Hoffman, who started LinkedIn. So I sort of take you through their stories and then run between them visits to places like Chicago Lawn, Washington, and Wall Street to show you how the world is changing. I'll stop there, and we now go to Yokai's video, right? He couldn't fly in, unfortunately, but I've seen the video, and it's excellent. So
I wish the snowstorm hadn't prevented me from coming to celebrate with you Nick's fantastically important new book, Transaction Man. I think it's a critical contribution at this moment as we're trying to understand where we've come from to this state of economic, social, and political dislocation, and how to think about it going forward. I want to focus on 3 points. The first is the power of ideas embedded in political coalitions with real programmatic content. By picking ideas men like Burley, like Jensen, Nick focuses us on the central role that ideas that shape how we see how the world works in allowing us to build political movements, but then also to translate them into real programs as the idea fill in the details. At the same time, it's really important to understand that the ideas standing on their own are not enough. They need to be embedded in political coalitions, whether it's the idea of the Corporation of Burley embedded in the New Deal, in the politics of the moment, in order to then be translated into new institutions. Whether it's Jensen's ideas that didn't just flow into the financial industry, but actually had to be part of a broader program of financial deregulation and allowing the industry and executive compensation to rise as they were, as part of, on one hand, the rising Reagan Republicans, and on the other hand, the skepticism on the left about the benevolence of the big state and its relationship with crony capitalism to big companies. So ideas have to be embedded in political coalitions in order to make a difference, and this is as true for tomorrow as it was for the last 100 years. The second point I'd love for us to focus on is that when we are looking for an alternative to the present, we cannot look back in nostalgia to a hypothesized moment where things were much better and government functioned just fine. And here again, I'd be curious if the panel will end up discussing the question of the relative role of the left, the Democrats in the 1970s, the consumers movement, in recognizing that the government as it functioned in the 40s and 50s had strong advantages of solidarity, but at the same time supported domination, whether it was patriarchy, whether it was race, and was far from perfect, and was closely integrated with the companies. So you have both a right but also a left rejection of the cozy relationship that typifies institution man. And the big difference is that the right has a full program in its political coalition to how to translate this into the neoliberal economic program, whereas the left is much more focused on programmatic reform to address the more urgent, at the time at least, dimensions of domination of race and gender first and foremost. And so you see this relative success of both coalitions on both sides, each one at its core concern. The third and last is a bit of a pushback or criticism on Network Man, because I actually think that by picking Reid Hoffman, the book accepts too much the Silicon Valley version of techno-liberalism or techno-utopianism as the thing that embeds networks. And in fact, I think that Wikipedia and free software and the kind of social mobilization we saw around SOPA PEPA 6 or 7 years ago, around net neutrality, the transformative role that Black Lives Matter had for how we perceive police shooting of black men, the transformative role of Me Too in shaking the establishment around questions of sexual harassment and abuse. The fact that Bernie and Warren each is outraising other competitors while rejecting corporate donations, providing a completely new model of response for democracy that's not based on more regulation, but actually based on people coming together. So I think as we move forward, it's critical that we think of the network, not naively. We understand there are problems with Russian propaganda. We understand there are problems with trolls and white supremacists and anti-vaxxers. Pangloss has long since left the room when we think about the network. But I think as an idea, the idea of the network as a social connection, allowing us to act both economically and politically, as neighbors, as peers, as citizens, solving these core problems of how are we productive with and for each other? How do we fulfill each other's basic needs? How do we govern ourselves? Integrating this networked form into a new and revived public power, into a new and revived conception of corporations as more responsible to their communities, not just to their shareholders, seems to me to be central. And it's there that I think we need to explore the possibility that networks provide a genuine idea alternative, both to Transaction Man and to Institutions Man. I wish I could be with you. I hope you have a fantastic conversation, and congratulations again on this timely and important book.
Great. Bijou, you're next.
Okay, so, I mean, as Yochai said, it's absolutely brilliant book in terms of the making accessible this huge landscape changes.
Do you mind grabbing the microphone?
Oh. So, I mean, as you guys said, it's such the book is brilliant in terms of the 100-year span that it covers. You know, producing these narratives, these stories as a storytelling book. It's absolutely brilliant. I'm so glad you didn't listen to your early academic wetters and toss the stories out. I mean, the book made me laugh. It made me cry. It made me. You know, it did everything. You know, it's a story about Burley, but it's not just a story about Burley in that beginning moment. It's a story about Beatrice, his wife. I mean, she's brilliant. I mean, nobody would have been able to recover the kind of history that you did without the kind of diligent and extremely thoughtful details she seemed to be able to capture all the time. And then, you know, Jensen and Reid Hoffman, and, you know, then, you know, resurrecting, I would say, Bentley, Arthur Bentley, the political scientist. So as ideas, you know, and making those ideas talk to the ground, so to speak, through the stories of Chicago Lawn. I mean, the absolutely fascinating stories from everybody from Ann Collier to Nick Deandra, all the way down to Earl Jones. I mean, it's like, it's absolutely brilliant at that level. I mean, I think, you know, what, at the minimum, what the book has absolutely made available for us is a way to think about the last 100 years in a completely accessible way, in a way where, you know, you can grab onto characters and see the relationship between ideas and those characters, right? So I think at that level, it's just absolutely brilliant and fascinating. Now the book ends with this: after going through the institution man, the transaction man, the network man, or these three, you know, kind of large idea formations, the book ends with an afterword where, you know, you go back to somebody like Arthur Bentley, and you're essentially trying to say, will we ever get anywhere in terms of an explanatory power, in terms of being able to really understand how society works, if we are wedded to this idea of a grand narrative? And so instead switches levels to, you know, a much more, what seems like just a few inches off the ground, this idea of interest groups and, you know, how they battle it out. And so, and Nick presents it as a toolbox, kind of, you know, here's how you think about society. Take any big slice of society, take a cross-section of it, try and find all the different ways in which groups are organized, and all of this is recovering Bentley, and then bringing out all those, bringing out how these political battles are taking off, and therefore the ways in which it will shape society going into the future, right? I mean, it's lovely, it's good to go there, and I mean, inspired by that idea of pluralism, I want to kind of use a very different organizing principle to kind of talk, to kind of think about everything that there in Nick's book and the world we live in today over the next 5-6 minutes, which is, I want to bring in the concept of a contradiction, right? And what this notion of a contradiction does for me is it allows me to go from the absolute material reality on the ground to immediate political battles, to big ideas. It allows me to scale all three levels. And the way I simply want to present it is that the world exists and is constantly dealing with crises. That is, contradictions are constantly coming up. Different forces, social forces, are jostling against each other. trying to outmaneuver, trying to push, trying to create new spaces, new pathways. And these contradictions always arrive at resolutions, temporary resolutions maybe, but nevertheless resolutions. And those resolutions give us an era, give us an epoch, give us a space that lasts in that relative stability of that temporary resolution. So that's one way of thinking about what happened post the New Deal, and that there was a particular set of contradictions in terms of everything, economic contradictions that came through the Roaring Twenties, the robber barons, etc., all the way to the rise of both fascism and communism, the fear in America of all these forces, and how those contradictions produced the New Deal, the organization, the institutional spaces, etc., and that temporary resolution. And from there, going on to the transaction man, my way of looking at that contradiction is something that actually, I mean, for me, that was the unfortunate part, which is it showed up in the afterword. It showed up in the epilogue, right? Which is, what happened, the story of capitalism in the 1970s is that capital is claiming and arguing that it's experiencing a crisis of profitability, right? And the crisis of profitability and the contradictions thereof, and if you look at what Reagan does, the breaking of the air traffic controller strike, if you look at what Thatcher does, breaking of the miners' strike, if you look at all that, it is attempting to resolve that crisis of profitability that capital is claiming, that is unfolding at that point. And then, there's this beautiful moment in the afterword, in the epilogue of the book, wherein, Nick talks about how there are these pools of money floating around trying to find space of investment. And if you follow that contradiction from that originary moment in the 70s, where capital is claiming this crisis of profitability and all the ways in which the welfare state is broken down, everything that came through the Keynesian Compact is destroyed. Labor unions are declawed, everything that happens. And what happens by the early 2000s is, if you want to go to the dependent variable, independent variable form, by the early 2000s, capital is no longer claiming a crisis of profitability. As a matter of fact, there's a new crisis, there's a new contradiction in place. It's a crisis of overaccumulation. There are these giant pools of capital. The current crisis that capital is experiencing right now is not anything to do with profitability, though that's the public discourse. But it's a giant pool of capital sloshing around the world trying to find spaces of investment, right? And so they will pick any idea. And so in that sense, the revolution that happened, the neoliberal revolution, tailgated straight into the network formation. So which is why we have formations like Uber or LinkedIn or any number of these things, right? And so I think we really need to understand that if we think through, let's say, a concept like contradictions, we'll come up with a story that connects all three levels, and that's one way of thinking about this. The last thing I'll say as a comment is, if you're trying to think about other ways of thinking about what is going to come, I mean, one is, I'll just give you a little bit of a story in about, I'm looking at the time. Yeah, okay, I've got 3 minutes or so, according to my own timer. But, I'm in the Bay Area, and I'm sitting in an Afghani restaurant with a bunch of Uber drivers, and one of them is this guy called Sultan Nouri. And, he leans across to me in this kind of conspiratorial tone, and he says, Biju bhai, hum sab bandar hai, which translates to, we are all monkeys. And I'm like, what do you mean, Nouri? And he starts explaining. He says, I feel like he's a brilliant human being. He's 65 years old, has his sparkling eyes. He's well read in a certain interesting set of ways. He says, what? When I'm driving Uber, I feel like one of those monkeys in a laboratory, in a pharmaceutical company laboratory. I feel that Uber's got my head open and they're watching my brain, right? Every time I speed up at a certain intersection, they're capturing that data. Every time I make a turn, they're capturing that data, right? And he says, and they're constantly giving me different stimuli to make me do different things. And they're capturing all that data, right? These conversations with workers Nouri, all the way out in India. I had this absolutely epiphanical kind of moment when a driver, a Ola driver, sitting on the terrace of a cultural center in Hyderabad, in my hometown, suddenly starts talking about a magic wand, that there's nothing fixed in the world of Uber and Ola. Ola is the equivalent of Lyft in India. And he starts talking about that how they wave a magic wand and everything about that experience changes, right? To anybody looking from the outside, it seems like the same world. There's a guy, he's a driver, he's driving, you press a button on a phone, the guy shows up. But his experience is changing rapidly based on the data that's being collected. So I want to kind of present this. I want to say that there's going to be an emergent struggle around data. Who owns this data? I was talking to a worker who works in the Amazon and FedEx warehouses in Newark, and she was telling me that they wear a bracelet, right? And that bracelet measures every little thing that happens. It's got the exact same technology as the Fitbit that some of you may be wearing, right? But it's for completely different purposes. The data is captured. Everything is constantly retuned. I mean, the Uber data that's captured from an Uber driver, an Uber taxi driver, is going to define Uber Eats. It defines a new product, a completely new line. It goes to define something like the autonomous car project. It defines auto insurance going into the future, right? So that data, which is being captured in one labor process, is constantly moving across multiple processes, multiple products, multiple organizational spaces, constantly creating value. And in the context of, let's say, the ecological crisis, which is another set of contradictions, all the work that we do to resolve those kinds of things also will create new value. And a lot of the value is going to come through data. So my question becomes, who owns the data? Why is it not the worker in the Amazon warehouse or the Uber driver? I mean, if you take New York City, every day there are 1 million for-hire vehicle rides, including taxis, Uber, etc. Average fare is about $15. So that's $15 million worth of value. I don't care whether the autonomous car comes or doesn't, but if it does in 5 years or 10 years or 3 years or 25 years, that's $15 million of value being produced on everyday basis at today's prices. And the question becomes, how much of it belongs to the taxi drivers, the Uber drivers of today's New York, right? And what we do with that. How do we imagine a new state solution that thinks through these questions of details? So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Kim, over to you.
Great. Well, let me join in saying that this is an extremely rich and powerful and complicated book, and there's a lot to talk about in every part of it. So actually, it could sustain a much longer conversation than we have tonight. All three sections are just extremely. There's so much to think about in each part of it, and also the way that you switch frames from the thinkers to the kind of history of Chicago lawn. It's a extremely. It gives you there's a lot of material here. So as I was getting ready, I took a look at the book that the work starts with. Adolf Berle's The Modern Corporation and Private Property. And the edition that I happen to have is a contemporary edition, but it includes the 1967 introduction by Adolf Berle. And one can see, in a way, taking a look at this, I just wanted to read a little clip of it to give you a sense about what the book is like. And I think part of what inspired you, I could see why you would want to write about this. Because this is Berle writing in 67, so no longer in the throes of the Great Depression, no longer in the kind of moment of the kind of the fundamental the blow to capitalism and the sort of sense of the supremacy of business. Even in the late 60s, at this moment of profound, rapid economic growth, he writes, few American enterprises and no large corporations can take the view that their plants, tools, and operations are their own, and that they can do what they please with what they own. Corporations are essentially political constructs. Their perpetual life, their capacity to accumulate tens of billions of assets and to draw profit from their production and their sales has made them part of the service of the supply of the United States. So there is this vision of the corporation and of the entire project of kind of generating profit through the corporation as part of the public project of the country. And he goes on to say that the key problem of the future that he sees is not really going to be economic any longer, how to produce stuff, but philosophical, how to live a good and meaningful life. He writes, mere wallowing in consumption would leave great numbers of people unsatisfied. Their demand would be for participation. So, Amazon might be surprised to hear this, that this is, again, and I think it's a very striking vision. And it's so different from the world and the basic assumptions that we live with now. And I think Burley, shares this with a whole cadre of people in the mid-20th century. John Kenneth Galbraith, in a way, I think even Keynes as well. Joseph Schumpeter, although Schumpeter takes a very different political stance and mourns the demise of the entrepreneur. But there's this whole group of people of economic thinkers who put forward this extraordinarily different vision of what the corporation, not even just what it should be, but what it kind of empirically is. And I think what is so compelling about this book is kind of its commitment to fleshing out these views of economic life. And you do something similar with the later thinkers in the book as well. But the way that thinking about the economy becomes a way of constructing a whole vision of society, and it's not just the abstract mathematical depiction that you can get in economics class, but it really is this window into thinking about the whole social world. And then beyond that you could think of the economy in ways that are really different from the way that people think about it now. So as you write in the beginning, the form of the world we live in now is not inevitable. It isn't the result of inexorable processes, globalization, that were too powerful to resist. Instead, it came from a series of choices that we, or at least America's business and economic elites, made. And so and I think this is very closely tied to the willingness to go into these economic worldviews, the sense that if we thought about things differently, and you can think about things differently, you can imagine a different future. So I think it's a very, I think this is what I loved about the book. I think, so I would suggest a couple of kind of ways into, or questions that came for me from the book. The first is that you suggest this move from institutions to transactions as the key kind of metaphor that changes, and then to networks as well. But in a way, a lot of it is to transactions. And I wondered if that was kind of what this kind of the strengths and limits of that, I guess, as a way of thinking about it. Is the way to think about the kind of order that comes out of the New Deal really, even in the work of Burley, what is giving rise to this different vision of the corporation? And is that vision, or is that different sense of the role of the corporation society really what makes the post-war order distinctive? Is it what leads to the relatively more equal distribution of income generated during those years? Is it what gives rise to the particular form of political economy that comes out of that moment? And here, I think, as I would suggest that where is the role of kind of contest and challenge to that? Did corporate executives themselves really accept so fully the vision that someone like Burley or Galbraith or whoever had for them? Wasn't there always a lot more, the Treaty of Detroit, for example, the famous contract between the UAW and General Motors in 1950 that sets out the cost of living adjustments and the kind of regular, sort of symbolizes for, at the time and afterward, the full acceptance of the role of unions and this, the Treaty of Detroit, does it really represent as thoroughgoing a capitulation on the part of GM to this vision as you think, or as Burley thought, I guess? so I guess that's the first question that I had. The second is with transactions, and this I think speaks to Biju's comment, or like what does happen in the 7 days? In some ways, the book has this strong sense of the economic ethos. One ethos comes to replace another. And this, I think, also Yokai's comment about the left and the right, and I think you explore very powerfully the way that the New Deal order comes under critique from a variety of different perspectives. It's not just a conservative assault, but also different problems and tensions. At the same, which emerge within it. At the same time, I don't know, I wondered about transactions as the key to finance and what changes with the rise of finance, this more financialized version of capitalism. And partly, actually, it's out of Jensen himself. And I think it's not, is it the transactionality that matters, or the decline of the institution, the sense of impermanence or the new investment or in sort of deal making and rapid profit without long-term, potentially speculative profits without a sense of long-term gain? I don't know. I think there's another way in which it's about power. And even in Jensen, the heart of his argument is that shareholders must be given greater power over the firm. It's not just that they are more transactional. It's that they are able to use the power of ownership in a new and different, in a more aggressive, more forceful way. And of course, they're part of this much broader kind of organization of business in a variety of realms, including in public policy, and a willingness to use the power of business to strike a different, to undermine labor unions and attack them, and to assault the different institutions that had previously, I think, were necessary to give rise to whatever vision of the corporation someone like Burley is putting forward. So I guess that's my second question: is finance as a way of of exercising social power more than just the short-term nature of the transaction. And I think this is the third point third question I would have, I think, is that the book, so it kind of sketches out these three different economic visions, worldviews, but you also throughout, partly through the studies of Chicago law, have this other sense of kind of other values that different groups have, activists. This comes really, for me, it came to the forefront in the description of the grassroots response to the 2008 crisis. And the variety, which was really very powerful reporting on the range of different things that people did to try to fight foreclosure. And the different different community groups doing, again, this kind of, from ground up research on the impact of foreclosure, and then trying in this very laborious, one house and one family at a time way to provide direct assistance to the families that had gotten fleeced and were facing the loss of their homes. And, I wanted to hear more. Where did these people did not buy into the transactional ethos, or even a sense of kind of the rightness of the banks or something. So what are the other, at any given moment, and today too, what are the other sort of places that alternative economic values are formed? What's a space in which these other kind of a kind of challenge to the dominant economic ethos of any age, where does it come from? I think I'll wrap up there. Or I guess I was somewhat curious also about kind of the role of sort of the role of women, and sort of the three kind of types of the organization man, transaction man, or network man are all kind of just typified as male. And so I just wondered, what do you see for any of these thinkers? Did things play out differently for women? But the book has, as you can see, this is it's tricky to talk about it in a short form way because it just gives you there's a lot going on in it.
Okay, so Thank you. I think what I should do, officially I'm supposed to respond, but I don't think I will respond because there's like too many things flying around. We should just go directly to the questions from the audience, and later we'll have, Transaction Man weekend retreat at, and get into all this stuff. There's a lot of themes here, and it's really fun to see how many conversations we can start having to follow up on them. So if you have a question, you're meant to go to one of these two mics.
Hi there. Thank you so much, everyone on the panel, for such a fantastic crystallization of some of these big moments in political economy over the last 100 years in America. And one thing I was hoping you might elaborate on is the relationship between the United States and other countries in the globe. So, I mean, if we think about the 1970s and the transition to neoliberalism, a lot of times these political economic projects were imposed, and quite violently, in fact. We can look at Latin America, we can look elsewhere. And sometimes there was a very specific developmental apparatus that was kind of marshaled to change a set of countries' economies to kind of make them in the image of the United States. You may agree or disagree with that. But a lot of these countries in what we call now, the global South, never really experienced a type of Keynesian or institution man order in the first place. And so one question I have is what does that transition look like for those countries that are not the United States but are elsewhere in the globe? And does the absence of an institution man type of economic arrangement today mean a different type of insecurity or flexible workforce that is perhaps more vulnerable now in this era of global inequality?
I guess one part of the answer to that's a very big and good question is, there's it's not really what you asked, but it's part of the whole picture of what's going on globally, politically, is that the American unpaid labor job in heavy industry got globally arbitraged with effects that produce a morally complicated problem, but devastating political effects here in the U.S. and in much of the rest of the developed world. So I agree with you that, it was kind of like a transfer where that old system exited the United States, at least in the blue-collar labor form, and went to the global South and the developing world without the social system being transferred with it. It got sort of stripped out. So, just this world that Burley, in his self-satisfied later years, wrote about as a regime that would last forever, proved amazingly fragile for reasons that we've touched on a little bit. Sir?
Yeah, thank you for everyone for being here and offering your ideas and insights into this book and this time of where we are in and connecting past and present. And so in thinking about connecting past and present, I have two elements of a question. One, fascinating that you talk about, I guess I'll go back to, past. What did you see in your research, or is there anything, as we think about tech companies in the present, like platform networks, et cetera, that we talk about with like Reid Hoffman being kind of emblematic of that movement in company and business and social order in regards to companies? What, like places like IBM, or what was the role of these kind of these corporations that were around the 60s and 70s that were, dominant in the kind of technological IT space and the corporate order? I'm just wondering, was there anything in your research in terms of the role of those companies, the ideas that were propagated from those kind of leaders coming out of those companies? First, and second part, when we think about Reid Hoffman, it's interesting for someone who's been in education, tech, and politics. I've thought of Reid Hoffman in this way. I don't know what you've thought of him in regards to your books. I'm excited to read about that. But I've thought about him as he's not just been a technologist. Like Reid Hoffman has gone, he's a Rhodes Scholar, or no, he's not a Rhodes Scholar. He went to Oxford. He's a Marshall Scholar, and Stanford guy, but has thought about. He often, he doesn't think about entrepreneurship or technology in a silo. He thinks about, at least he conveys, and he thinks about policy, philosophy. And he's as not, and I'm trying to give him too much credit here, but we have some other folks in tech and business who have had a very narrow conception. So I'm wondering if you could also, when we think about the present, what are your thoughts on Reid Hoffman and this place we're in, moving forward in the networks and the philosophy that they bring, that Bijou talked about as well. So the elements of the past and corporations and the ideas around tech companies in the 60s and 70s, and now looking at what do you think about and what are you saying around Reid Hoffman and the ideas that are coming out of now Silicon Valley?
Do you want to, because there's a direct question to you.
On the quick question, Reid Hoffman, first of all, I'm very grateful to him as a journalist because he let me embed with him and spend a great deal of time with him and get sort of rich picture of life in Silicon Valley. He is, this sort of new-ish breed of a passionate liberal and corporate business executive. He's one of the biggest donors to Barack Obama and so on. He definitely has the vision of a good world without structures and institutions, and a good world built around fluidity, not around community and groups and institutions and structures. So his vision of the good is, in the current moment, he was very active in, unsuccessfully, in trying to make Trump lose the election. And now his big campaign is, let's get rid of political parties because they stand in the way of progress. My prejudice would be, let's keep political parties because they stand in the way of chaos. So there's a fundamental difference in perspective there. But he's an extremely, kind of well-meaning person, and what I'm trying to bring to light is sort of a vision difference. On IBM, I'm oversimplifying, but IBM rose to power in the mainframe age when there just weren't that many computers in the whole United States. There was probably one in this building, but it went from, computers themselves were seen as part of this big institution structure. And IBM was a company where you wore a white suit to work every day, and you had this little sign on your desk that said think, and you got transferred every 2 years, and then you retired at 65. And that blew up at IBM and elsewhere. So now the dream is one where, as Reid says about LinkedIn, you own your career, it lives in your LinkedIn profile, it's not, being an employee of a big corporation isn't important anymore, and it's a much better world. I'm not sure I agree with him, but that's the vision. And, you see this up close and personal. He was a key investor in either Uber or Lyft or both, and Airbnb. And, part of his whole vision is let's unstructure these unionized activities and create a wonderful, creative new world, which you love, I'm sure.
Do you want to get in the middle? I have a couple of things.
Why don't you speak to it?
All right. So I actually want to go back to the question around the quote-unquote third world, the developing world, very briefly, because I think the fascinating thing about the book itself is Chicago School, right? Which is where the entire neoliberal framework comes out of, and the transaction, the acceleration of the financial world, and the emergent hegemony of finance capital comes out of Chicago School, and it's the exact same set of actors, right, who are moving into Latin America, right, and so so in that sense, there's this absolute continuity between an experiment that was born in Chicago School that goes south into Latin America in and intervenes in societies which have been post-colonial disaster zones in terms of the fact that much of the post-colonial dream of producing some kind of an egalitarian society based on, coming out of colonialism at some level, is completely, it's just coming into formation. You must realize that much of the post-colonial world didn't have that period from the 1930s onwards all the way to the 70s, the golden age of American capitalism. Most of these countries are beginning to create that framework in the mid 50s, early 60s. And by the 70s, you have the Chicago School just completely blowing those places up. Of course, what happened in Chile and Allende, etc., is legend in one way. So, and if you go to the Middle East, if you go to if you go to the West Asia, what we are right now seeing in Syria or any of those spaces is a product of pushing what emerges out of the Chicago School along with the World Bank, IMF kind of Washington consensus down the throats of many, many countries. I know American imperialism, is part of the story in many ways, right? So the question is that during the period of the institution man, American imperialism added to that surplus that could be distributed. But post the emergence of Chicago School hegemony, that surplus was also gone. Right? So I think that's important. And the last part of that story is immigration. As you destroyed country after country after country, you have waves and waves of new immigrants who are economic refugees at some level, right? Who are seeking new ways of locating themselves in the imperial center, right? That's also happening. Now, very quickly to respond to the other question, I think really, if you think about, I just want to say that IBM, et cetera, are also still responding to the game. If you look at the hottest acquisition that IBM has made in the last 1 year, it's Red Hat, Linux. They're trying to take over the cloud space, making certain predictions about what's going to happen with the cloud, and that's what they're doing. Now, what I want to talk about, again, I want to go back to data, right? If you talk about Reid Hoffman and LinkedIn, he's talking scale. He's constantly talking scale. He doesn't care. So, I don't know how many people in this room know that Uber, for instance, to date has not made a single penny in profit, right?
Yeah, and I should
Uber-
say, Reid drives his PR person nuts because he's coined this term blitzscaling.
Blitzscaling, right?
And his new book is called Blitzscaling. She says,
So it's this ridiculous idea that you just keep grabbing larger segments of the market, create monopolies, and that's your way past it. I think people like Reid Hoffman, I think we should be very worried rating them anywhere close to being a competent philosopher, even of the variety of somebody like Burley, right? I think it's just really, really dangerous to think about people like Reid Hoffman, because all Reid Hoffman at one level symbolizes is a shift within finance capital. That is, the industrial capital was displaced through the second contradiction, the crisis of profitability, and produced the hegemony of finance capital. But in the 40 years or 50 years, we've seen a shift within finance capital which is very, very present in Nick's book, but I would articulate it differently and say it's a shift from, traditional investment capital through investment houses like Morgan Stanley, et cetera, who are desperately at one moment trying to catch up with what emerges as a new hegemon, which is private equity and venture capital. And that's what Reid Hoffman symbolizes. He symbolizes venture capital at many levels. And I think we need to be very clear about it.
capital business as well. We have to end, or do we have to end? One more question?
Thank you. I have only made it through the first chapter of the book, so it's possible that you addressed this, although it was a question that both Professor Benkler and Professor Philip Fine raised in terms of taking economic ideas and planting them in the movement and what we do with them. And I'm just curious how you see the role of the field of economics in that, and how there's such a dominant, so many dominant ideas, and how those get changed such that we can then so that the field can serve people and make things better.
So that's another big question, but I'll start with just an anecdote. So this book started. I was invited to give the Tanner lectures at Stanford, and that morphed into the book. They were in January 2014, I guess. So there's 2 lectures, and I gave the second lecture, and it's time for questions. And the first questioner pops up, which is the then 94-year-old Kenneth Arrow, Nobel Prize-winning economist. And he sort of gets up and says, my dear boy, this is all very interesting, but really everything you're describing was inevitable. So why are you bothering to describe it in such detail? And so I kind of have a prejudice that if you're talking about these issues of what we're calling political economy, we need to sort of put the politics back in political economy and not let the whole conversation be controlled by economists and not account for the role of institutions, interest groups, all the things that we've all been talking about. So it's not just a within economics change that I think would be good, but it's a sort of making the conversation more interdisciplinary. I've gotten, frustrated on the other side. I mean, this whole other conversation is sort of, I talked about the dependent variable. So there are a whole bunch of books about the dependent variable. I'm thinking of Robert Putnam's recent book called Our Kids. And that book, my problem was there's no economics in it. And ditto Charles Murray's book called Coming Apart, is that what it's called? I mean, there's no economics in that book either. So those kinds of books have sort of conjure up these social ethoses that appear and then devastate communities and aren't embedded in any larger structure. So I guess I don't know if this is the answer you're looking for, but it's to try to explain and understand these things and advocate for change, reading in the role of the state, the role of activists, the role of interest groups, the role of policymakers, and not just present them as sort of economic questions that can be only answered by market structure or only social questions that don't have to do with economics. Sarita, take it away, because I know we're a little over.
I'm going to be short and sweet here. I'm Sarita Gupta. I'm the director of the Future of Workers program here at the Ford Foundation. I'm really thrilled by this conversation, and I want to thank Biju and Kim again so much for your comments. And Nick, as I said before the program started, I really enjoyed the book, and just congratulations again. And one of the reasons, there are many that have already been stated for why I loved it. I also loved the storytelling throughout it. But as somebody who cut her teeth in organizing in Chicago, I had a very deep appreciation of you lifting up the story of Chicago Lawn, yeah, all of it very much resonated with me. I just want to share just a few remarks about how this book and what's been talked about is being employed in terms of strategies for the Future of Workers program. Nick said this multiple times, economic orders are made, not born. And this idea that we have a role to play in shaping our economic order and our futures is really important and really core to the work of the foundation. And in order to do that, we need institutions and interest groups, to this last point that was just made. So here at the foundation, the Future of Workers program has a strategy that is deeply rooted in those understandings. And we believe that we can and must shape the economy, the new economic order, if you will, and we're looking at it through the lens of the role of technology, right? So that we can improve economic security, opportunity, and dignity for all working people. Because again, here at the foundation, we are trying to address the drivers of inequality. So the Future of Workers program has been navigating the changing relationship between finance and business, as well as the pace at which new technologies are being introduced, because new technology is not new, right? But the pace at which it's being introduced is what we're paying attention to, and exploring the implications of all of this on workers. And some of this comes out in the Chicago Lawn story, but just the precariousness of work, the rise of precarious work, the upsurge of low-wage work, and what that means. What is the quality of life for low and middle income workers who've experienced more than 40 years of stagnant or declining pay, shrinking benefits, and reduced power on the job? And how the structure of the economy and thereby work has changed. So understanding how the structure of works and firms have shifted away from the mega firms, the IBMs, the Kodaks. I grew up in Rochester, New York, so Kodak was very big in my life, to more nimble firms, and that trend towards what David Weil calls fissuring, how that has been impacting the way workers, the quality of life for workers. If you're a subcontracted worker, or you're outsourced, you're an independent contractor, as Biju well knows, has huge implications in terms of your ability and voice to shape the economy in the future. And that, coupled with the shift towards the financialization or the maximizing shareholder value, is all of what our program is paying attention to. And really, both of these trends have reshuffled power relations among firms, investors, labor, and consumers, and essentially created these new rules of the economy that we're contending with today. So the questions we're asking is, who has real control? Who has real control in workplaces or within industries and sectors of the economy itself? Who has democratic control? Does the application of new technology or shifts in the organization of work speed up the concentration of wealth into the hands of a tiny select few? Or does it allow workers to get a fair share of the wealth that they're producing? And we know that new technologies have great potential to create new wealth in this new economic order that we're in today. But there's no economic law that says we will use that wealth well as a society to create economic mobility. So those are the kinds of questions that we're sitting with and grappling with as a program, and trying to figure out how we employ and support strategies that are essentially helping to create the new frameworks that we need in this moment, the new laws, the new policies, the new cultural frameworks, the new schools of thought that actually center the experiences of working people and help us address inequality in our society as a whole. There's multiple examples I can go into of the great work that we're supporting right now, but in the interest of time, I'll just say that we are very clear that as a foundation, and our program is really clear that we need to support the ideas, the institutions, and certainly the individuals who are really helping to shape what a new economic order could look like. And I just want to end with what, Nick, you just said at the very end here. This idea, the discourse right now projects an inevitability of like, this is the way the world is going to be. And part of what we're really trying to do is disrupt that inevitability, that notion of inevitability, and say it actually is going to take bringing multiple stakeholders together in order to think through really comprehensive solutions to, frankly, the inequality crisis that we're facing as a society today, and fundamentally to find solutions that ensure that people can live a dignified life. So that's what we're excited to be doing here at the Foundation. And so on that note, thank you again for the book, because I think it's given us a lot to process and think about. I just want to give a quick thanks to a few more thanks, adding on to Ethan earlier, to Sierra Poller, to Tara and Romig, Ebony Wilkinson, Thomas Helmick, and the events, catering, and security teams for being here tonight, for all that you did to help with this event, and certainly the civic engagement and government team, and specifically Ethan, who's done a lot to help make this event happen tonight. So thank you to you, Ethan. And there is continuation of the reception in the back, and Nick is willing to sign books, so please get your books. You could purchase your books out there, and he'll sign them. And oh, sorry, don't purchase them; they're free. And hopefully, I know there were a lot of questions. There was really great discussion here, but Nick is available, and so is Bijou and Kim for you all to continue the conversation. Thanks so much.
How you see earlier books, or kind of how